What if you woke up one day and found your heart pounding violently, as if your chest was about to burst open, the world around you spinning, and everything terrifying?
Yunchi, I'd guess I'd call that fear. A primal, overwhelming sensation that we've all experienced.
And most of us have probably had more than our fair share. Fear is an immense and dense subject, isn't it?
Definitely. We can experience fear over big obvious things like a runaway train headed our way or something as small as a pet tarantula. It's all over the place.
Yes, and everyone's fear response is different too. Like how you fear rejection letters from literary publishers, John, and I fear that my violin strings will snap and hit me in the eye during a performance.
That's specific, but precisely what we'll be exploring today. How fear grips us, why we fear what we fear, and how to cope with it.
Yes, we aim to make your goosebumps a little bit more understandable. So, John, any fears you'd like to share?
Well, let's see. I've got a long-standing fear of dogs. They're just too loud and unpredictable for my liking.
Huh. Now that you've shared, I'm wondering what fears our listeners might have. Certainly there must be all sorts of fears out there, right? John, isn't it fascinating how universal some fears are? I mean, take snakes and spiders, for example.
You mean how lots of people seem to be naturally afraid of them? Yeah, that is interesting.
Exactly. And what's even more captivating is that these fears often stem from our environment. The concept is evolutionary psychology.
Oh, you mean like how we develop a fear of things that could have posed a threat in the past? Like our ancestors could have been bitten by a venomous snake or spider, so we are naturally cautious of them.
That's right. It theorized that those who developed an instinctive fear of these threats managed to survive and pass on their genes, thus leading to this seemingly innate fear in the population.
But I wonder, if that's the case, why am I afraid of dogs and not snakes? I have never had a bad experience with a dog in my life, but still they make me uncomfortable.
Well, you're raising an important point. While some fears might be shaped by our genes, it's clear that individual experiences, culture, and even media can shape our fears.
Oh, right. Like how a lot of fears develop during childhood. Maybe I was scared by a barking dog as a toddler and don't consciously remember it.
That's entirely possible. These types of fears, which are linked to formative experiences, represent a different kind of learning. They aren't necessarily innate. Instead, they're acquired and often intensified by our unique individual experiences.
Yunchi, let's dig a bit deeper into the biology of fear. What exactly happens to our bodies when we're afraid?
Well, John, when we're faced with something scary, our nervous system springs into action. It releases chemicals like adrenaline to prepare our bodies for what's known as the fight or flight response.
Fight or flight, okay. Is this like how I feel when I see a dog and immediately want to run away?
Absolutely, that's a prime example. Your body is trying to protect you. It's saying either stand your ground and fight this threat, or get out of here as fast as possible.
That certainly reminds me of my encounters with dogs. But how does this relate to our previous discussion about fear triggers?
Great question. When our brain perceives a possible threat, it sends a signal to our adrenal glands. These glands then release adrenaline, causing our heart to beat faster, our muscles to tense up, and our senses to become heightened. This ultimately prepares us either to face the threat or flee from it. The specific triggers like spiders, dogs, or heights are often ingrained in us through our personal experiences or, as we discussed before, even evolutionarily.
Ingrained, like my dog fear might be from a forgotten childhood incident?
Possibly. And that's the fascinating thing about fear. While it's a universal human experience, the triggers can vary greatly from person to person.
Yunche, you talked about these triggers being ingrained. Any notable case that caught your eye?
Oh, certainly, there are so many diverse cases out there. It's simply fascinating. Take pogonophobia, for example.
Pogo what? You're making this up.
Nope. Pogonophobia is an irrational fear of beards. It might sound funny, but it can be crippling for some people. One woman, for instance, couldn't even bear to look at her own father once he grew a beard.
Wait, are you serious? So if I grow a beard, we might end up needing a new co-host.
Well, it's less common than something like arachnophobia or acrophobia, sure. But these less common fears remind us how perception shapes our realities. The bearded father is the same loving parent, yet his beard becomes a symbol of terror.
Okay, I'm not growing a beard then. Any more of these uncommon fears?
Oh, there are hundreds, John. Lechanophobia, or fear of vegetables, is another example. There was a teenager in the UK who suffered from this. It was so severe, even mentioning broccoli could trigger her fear reaction.
I think I have that, with Brussels sprouts. Finally, a scientific reason to avoid eating them. Yunchi, so we've talked about how people develop these uncanny fears, like the fear of vegetables. But what about the more universal fears, like fear of heights or darkness maybe? Those do make sense, right?
Absolutely, John. These fears, or rather phobias, often termed as natural environment phobias, do make a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. Take fear of heights or acrophobia, for instance. It can actually be seen as a survival instinct. Falling from a height could have fatal consequences, especially for our ancestors, so it's only natural to be fearful.
Sounds like my fear of roller coasters is justified then.
Ha ha ha, to an extent, yes. In fact, even fear of darkness or nyctophobia can be traced back to our survival instincts. Darkness usually signifies the unknown, making us more prone to threats we can't see. It makes people feel vulnerable and hence they fear it. Though, in most cases today, it's not really darkness that people fear, but rather what it conceals.
I've always wondered about that one. So it's the uncertainty, not actually the dark, that scares people. Interesting. What about water or fire? Those are pretty common fears too, right?
Yes, those are. Hydrophobia, or fear of water, and pyrophobia, or fear of fire, have deep roots in our instinctual need for survival too. Fire, though a life-sustaining force, is intrinsically dangerous, and water, although essential for life, presents the danger of drowning. Both are primal forces that our minds instinctively perceive as potentially deadly.
I guess we've just naturally evolved to become cautious of anything that can harm us, huh?
So, John, if I were to ask you to differentiate between fear and anxiety, what would your response be?
Isn't fear immediate while anxiety is about something that may happen in the future?
Well observed, John. Fear is a response to a recognized threat, while anxiety is a reaction to an unknown threat. Fear is more immediate, an emotional response to a real or perceived imminent threat. It's basic, primal, and helps us survive immediate dangers, like that snake lunging at you.
Don't even joke about that, Yunche.
Figuratively, John, figuratively. But moving on, anxiety, on the other hand, deals with the anticipation of future threat. It's vaguer. It's more associated with muscle tension and vigilance in preparation for future danger and cautious or avoidant behaviour. We often see this in situations where the outcome is uncertain, like waiting for job interview results or anticipating a difficult conversation.
That seems a little complex. I didn't realise there was so much going on in our minds just because of fear and anxiety.
Oh, there's more to it, John. Biologically, both fear and anxiety trigger the release of stress hormones. You know, that fight or flight stuff? But they differ in how they physiologically affect us. Fear causes more observable physical reactions like increased heart rate, rapid breathing and sweating. Anxiety, it lingers in the body for a prolonged period, which can be pretty debilitating.
Well, Yunche, this certainly puts things into perspective. But let's not forget, while these responses are rooted in survival, too much of either fear or anxiety can become a problem in our everyday lives. Just to confirm my understanding, Yunche, can unchecked fear escalate to anxiety disorders?
That's an excellent question, John. Yes, unchecked fear can indeed contribute to anxiety disorders. Fear and anxiety share overlapping brain circuits, so chronic fear can condition the brain to be overly reactive to danger signals, which might result in an anxiety disorder.
Interesting. So, our brain mistakenly recognizes the danger signals as threats when there's no real danger?
Exactly. Just imagine, John, our brain is like a highly advanced alarm system, designed to keep us safe. But sometimes, due to repeated exposure to fear triggers, this alarm system can become overly sensitive, sounding off threats even when there's no danger. It's like a smoke alarm that goes off when we're just making toast. It leads to ongoing anxiety even when we're not in any immediate danger.
That would be debilitating. Is there a way we can reset this overreactive alarm system?
There are definitely ways, John. Starting with acknowledging your fears, understanding them, and then taking action. Cognitive behavioral therapy techniques are often employed, aiming to change thought patterns, physical reactions, and behaviors.
Are there any coping mechanisms for fear and anxiety that anyone can try?
Yes, John. Easy and accessible ones include deep breathing exercises and progressive muscle relaxation techniques. These are aimed at slowing down a pounding heart and reducing tension. Meditation and mindfulness can also help, calming the mind, increasing self-awareness and helping one to stay grounded in the moment. And let's not forget maintaining a balanced lifestyle with regular sleep, a healthy diet, and regular exercise.
It sounds like properly managing fear and anxiety can really improve our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely, John. Embracing fear as a part of life and coping effectively can empower us to tackle challenges head-on and open ourselves to new experiences. So, we've been talking about how fear can escalate to anxiety. Let's now look at how our bodies respond when we're afraid. Essentially, there are 3 common responses: freeze, fight, and flight. Do these terms sound familiar, John?
Definitely, I've heard of them back when I was in university. The fight or flight response is quite popular, but I'm not quite sure what the freeze response is.
That's a great point. Let's start with the freeze response. When we encounter a fear stimulus, our immediate reaction might be to freeze. Humans evolved this response to help us avoid detection by predators, who are often attracted to movement.
Oh, I see. I remember one time when I was delivering mail, a dog snarled at me from behind a gate. I immediately stood still. It's interesting how that instinct kicks in.
Right, exactly. After the freeze phase, if the threat is still present, our bodies might mobilize us to fight or flee. This is where adrenaline comes into play. It prepares our body for action, making our heart race and muscles tense. Blood is directed towards major muscle groups and away from our digestive system. This is why you get that butterflies in the stomach sensation.
Ah, so the choice to either stand your ground and fight or run for your life is influenced by adrenaline.
Yes, exactly, John. Based on the perceived threat and our personal capacities, our body decides, often in a fraction of a second, whether to fight the threat or to run away. Fascinating, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've experienced this when I've been confronted at work. Sometimes I'd assert myself, other times I'd avoid the issue and literally walk away. I never thought of it as a fear response.
Well, now you have a new perspective on your own reactions, John. It's proof that our body has complex mechanisms wired to ensure our survival. Coping with fear is all about understanding these mechanisms better and training ourselves to manage our responses.
So I was thinking, Yunche, culture shapes fears too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Different cultures around the world have different beliefs and customs that generate unique fears.
Can you give us any examples?
Sure, one example could be the fear of the number 4 in some East Asian cultures. It's considered unlucky because in languages like Korean, Japanese and Chinese, the pronunciation for the word 4 is quite similar to the word for death.
That's interesting. I've heard about that, and it does induce a type of unease. What about individual fear responses? Do they vary culturally as well?
Absolutely, John. Some studies suggest that cultural values might affect how we respond to fear. For example, collectivist cultures emphasize the importance of community and social harmony, so fear responses in such cultures might align more with societal expectations. An individual might suppress their fear or react in a way that doesn't disrupt the group harmony.
Makes sense. While in individualistic societies, personal freedom and self-expression are valued, so impactful fear stimuli might cause a more overt fear response.
Exactly, John. It's fascinating how our upbringing and surrounding can shape our perception of fear and how we react to it.
It's incredible how deeply intertwined fear is with various aspects of our lives. Maybe we listeners could learn more about our own fear responses by reflecting on the cultural values that surrounded us as we grew up.
That's a fantastic idea, John. So, listeners, we invite you to ponder upon your unique fear responses. Reflect on your fears and ask yourself, how might my culture and upbringing have shaped how I react to fear? So, John, you mentioned earlier about the irrationality of some fears. But overcoming fear isn't as simple as just thinking logically about it, right?
Absolutely not, Yunche. There's this myth that fear is all in the mind and can be waved away with a rational approach. It oversimplifies the phenomenon. Fear involves a complex interplay between our emotions, cognition, and physical responses.
Then what are some of the effective methods to overcome fear?
There's no one-size-fits-all solution. However, commonly suggested methods often involve exposure therapy, gradual and repeated exposure to the fear trigger in a safe environment. It helps the mind to realize that the object or situation may not be as threatening as perceived.
I can vouch for that, John. For example, in a classroom situation, if a child has a debilitating fear of public speaking, we might start with the child presenting a short speech to just one friend, then slowly increase the audience size until they're comfortable speaking in front of the whole class.
Exactly, Yunche. Other techniques include mindfulness and relaxation exercises, cognitive restructuring, where you identify and challenge the negative thoughts contributing to fear, and even medications in severe cases.
And it's important to remember that overcoming fear is not about eliminating it entirely, but learning to manage and live with it. Fear is a natural human response after all.
Couldn't have said it better, Yunchi. Listeners, remember, it's okay to feel fear, and it doesn't make you weak. What matters is the courage to face and overcome it, step by step, at your own pace. Face your fears sounds cliché, doesn't it, Yunche?
You could say that, John. Often it's easier said than done.
True, Yunche. However, the underlying message carries weight. Confronting fears might be intimidating, but the first step often is the hardest. Let's discuss some motivational stories about this.
Sounds great, John. I remember this story of a child from my early days of teaching. Let's call him Minho.
A student story, I'm intrigued. Go on, Yunche.
Minho, he had this intense fear of dogs. It was so bad he couldn't even look at dog pictures without trembling. His parents explained that he had a traumatic dog-related incident when he was 2. So at school, when we started a program encouraging kids to share their fears and help each other, Minho instantly stood out.
I can imagine. Must have been quite a challenge. How did he confront this fear?
It was a slow process, John. We started with pictures, then videos of dogs. Later, we brought in a calm and friendly therapy dog. Over some months, Minho transformed from running away at the sight of dogs to being able to calmly pat the therapy dog. It was heartwarming seeing him overcome his fear, although he still walked a broad circle around other dogs.
That's indeed inspiring, Yunche. Confronting your fear may not necessarily mean complete eradication, but learning to coexist with it. This reminds me of a letter I once read during my mail rounds.
Oh, a letter faced its fear?
Well, the letter's sender, a man who overcame his fear of water by gradually exposing himself to it, started with being able to look at water, to dipping his toes, and eventually learned swimming. Now he's a lifeguard, saving lives.
Wow, that's amazing, John. Narratives like these truly highlight the essence of facing our fears, however intimidating they might be, and the potential for personal growth that lies beneath. John, why do you think people are so scared of public speaking?
Yunche, it's not really about speaking in public, is it? It's actually about the fear of judgment, of scrutiny. Nobody wants to embarrass themselves and become the laughing stock.
Spot on. Personally, I feel this fear is rooted in our social conditioning as well. We're constantly told what's socially acceptable and not, right? In other words, societal expectations can be a trigger to some of our fears.
That's a good point, Yunche. So, how does one combat this kind of fear?
Well, I'd say, first acknowledge that fear. It's okay to have that fear. From my experience working with children, teaching them about these fear integration techniques reduces the burden of the fear. However, societal stigma can make fear a difficult topic to handle, and I've seen it hampers discussion about it as well.
Yes, societal perceptions can often make it even more difficult for individuals to address their fears. But what if these individuals were provided with a safe environment where they wouldn't be judged for their fears?
That would definitely help. Safe spaces that encourage open conversations about fear, ones that don't belittle or stigmatize, can play a significant role in fear management.
So, cultivating a supportive community where fears can be expressed openly is important. You know, efforts like these can go a long way in challenging societal norms around fear.
We've come pretty far in our discussion of fears, haven't we?
Yes, Yunchi, and so much more to explore. Fear's reach is incredibly vast, isn't it?
Absolutely, and an important part of it is how fear is perceived across different societies and cultures. Fear isn't just a uniform concept, is it? It hugely varies based on where and how you grow up.
That's something I hadn't thought about before. Could you elaborate more on that?
Sure, John. For example, in Western cultures, fear and anxiety are often seen as individual experiences, more of a personal struggle. There is this emphasis on individual autonomy, and expressing fear can sometimes be seen as a sign of weakness. For this reason, many might suppress their fears, avoiding that vulnerability.
That's interesting. How does that compare to how Eastern cultures handle fear?
In contrast, in certain Eastern cultures, particularly those with more collectivist values like ours, fear often carries a social aspect. Fears not only affect the individual, but they have implications on the person's social roles, their familial relationships, and even status, so there is an intricate web here. And also fear can serve as a bonding mechanism. A shared fear can bring people closer.
Wow, a bonding mechanism. That's fascinating. I have heard that cultures steeped in folklore and superstition often fear supernatural entities as well, right?
Spot on, John. Many traditional beliefs incorporate fear of mythological creatures, spirits, or gods. This serves to maintain societal norms and instill moral values. Yet this cultural layering of fear, while binding communities and preserving traditions, can have negative implications, as these fears can also serve to police individual behavior and restrict personal freedoms.
So it seems like the way fear is handled is as diverse as the human race itself. Really goes on to show how complex and multifaceted this emotion is.
Exactly, John. And that's why it's so crucial to understand how distinctive and deeply rooted aspects of fear can help us better interpret why we behave the way we do when faced with our fears.
Speaking of fears, Yunche, there's a really close relationship between fear and traumatic experiences. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely, John. Trauma is often synonymous with fear, isn't it? The human brain registers traumatic events as intensely fear-provoking, and this is embedded in our emotional memory. That's why when this memory is triggered later, it brings along a fear response. Would it be right to say it's a subconscious time travel, John?
What a unique way to put it, Yunchi. Subconscious time travel indeed. This can truly impact lives, right?
You're right, John. Prolonged exposure to traumatic situations like abuse or war can lead to mental health conditions, including post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD as it's commonly known. PTSD actually develops as an abnormal fear response where the individual might relive the traumatic event, manifest intense fear, and even avoid situations that might remind them of the trauma.
That sounds incredibly difficult. It's almost like being stuck in a loop of fear. Is the cycle ever broken?
John, it's a tough journey, no doubt. But with professional help, like cognitive behavioral therapy, individuals can develop coping mechanisms to manage their fear responses better. It's all about rebuilding that sense of safety and control in their life.
It's reassuring to know that, Yunche. The intertwined nature of fear and trauma further underscores the necessity to approach fear with empathy and understanding. Our own fears may seem trivial compared to these, right?
Absolutely, John. It's a good reminder that fear is subjective, and what might seem trivial to us can feel like a mountain to others. It's time to address some of our listeners' burning questions about fear. John, care to read the first one?
What's the most unusual phobia you've come across? Well, there are countless fascinating phobias out there, so it's hard to pick just one. But if I'd have to choose, trypophobia, the fear of irregular patterns or clusters of small holes or bumps, is definitely notable.
Definitely interesting. Returning to the inbox, there's one from a listener asking, what if my anxiety doesn't originate from fear? Well, anxiety doesn't always have a clear trigger. Sometimes it springs from general unease or worry about potential future events. It's not as immediate or specific as fear, but it can be just as intense.
Good point, Yunqi. Now, on to our next question. Is there a fear you have managed to overcome? Well, as I've mentioned before, I used to suppress my emotions, which led to fear of emotional vulnerability. However, acknowledging and addressing it has helped considerably. It's an ongoing process, though.
Such an inspiring journey, John. Speaking of which, it's about time to share some of our listeners' own inspiring accounts. We hope that these stories of triumph over fear will encourage everyone listening today. Here's an inspiring account from one listener. I've always had a deep-seated fear of public speaking, but I didn't shy away from it. I sought exposure therapy, gradually faced my fear bit by bit, and now I'm a motivational speaker.
Wow, that's inspiring. It goes to show how confronting our fears, instead of avoiding them, could lead us to places we've never dreamed of. There's another similar success story. I had a fear of water and couldn't even take a bath without panicking. But with encouragement from my family and a devoted swimming coach, I faced my fear, and now swimming is my favorite pastime.
This is just incredible. Encountering fear is part of being human, but these stories remind us that we can rise above it. Our fears should never be a shackle, but rather become a stepping stone to personal growth.